After the shot heard round the world at Lexington, everyone knew that it was a war and it was on. So it's a war. Who has the best chance of winning? Well, let's take a look at Britain's strengths first of all. Their military was the best in the world. They just succeeded in having 100 years of victories along the way. And so there was a lot of evidence that they were the best in the world. Their soldiers were well equipped, well disciplined, they were well paid and well fed. Beyond that, the British Navy dominated the seas. They had just won that war and everyone was respecting them. They had much greater access to funds. They had more people in England and they could tax them and get away with that. In fact, they had so much money that they could hire mercenaries. This isn't to say that people weren't taxed and that it was a burden, but they were able to hire mercenaries that would come and fight for them. And so they hired about 30,000 Hessians to fight for them. That's what they called them at the time. They came from an area around Germany, modern-day Germany. But they had these strengths and many others. In addition to that, though, there were some weaknesses for them. And we can take a quick look at that. They weren't fighting at home like the Americans were. They were fighting a war on another continent, and they were far from home. In our day and age, communication is very easy and quick, but at that time, it wasn't. In our day and age, we can fly things over someplace else in the world if we wanted to. In this time, you had to put it on a ship and move it there. So in fighting a war on another continent was a very tricky deal. So orders, troops, and supplies can take months to reach their destinations and can get pretty confusing as they do. So I'm going to highlight fighting a war on another continent far from home because that was an important weakness for the British. Also, their objectives there were difficult. How do you win this battle? You've got to persuade these colonists to give up their claims of independence. And how are you going to do that? It helps that you've got royals mixed in, people who are in favor of continuing on as British subjects, but you've still got to persuade these people to quit fighting you. Then there's the whole geographic vastness of the colonies. They are actually much larger than England itself. They also do not have a capital city. So how do you conquer them? If you attack England, you take London and the government there, and you've got a good chance of winning. If you attack France, you can take Paris. But in this country, there is no Washington, D.C. yet. Ultimately, there is a government set in Philadelphia, but even there, it's so decentralized that people can just leave, and they do, ultimately. But Britain had other problems as well. They had to spread their armies around the world and hold on to some territories of their own. So they needed to defend Britain from the Irish, and with the difficulties going on there. And while they had just won the war against France and other countries, they still needed to be aware that France was itching to cause them trouble, so they could not look weak there. Another weakness of the British government was that they were not well run at the time, and these citizens were divided about the war even within their own country. They didn't want to be spending this much money on it or sending some of their better resources a long way away. And the British generals that were sent there weren't necessarily the best. There are some good ones among them, but they weren't necessarily even the ones that were put in charge. So it helps that they did not necessarily know how to fight the best. While the soldiers may have been very good, the generals that were leading them weren't always the best. Now, the colonists had some strengths of their own. They were fighting for a cause that they could care about, a grand cause. They were fighting for their rights, they were fighting for their independence, and they were fighting for liberty. And so they cared about these causes, and they could feel like they were in the moral right fighting for them. And while their leaders were inexperienced, they were surprisingly competent and/or, as I added, quick learners. Some of them, like Henry Knox, find ways to manage colossal tasks when he goes to get the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to menace the British in Boston. And so a lot of these leaders, like George Washington, come along and learn how to be very competent. So leaders were surprisingly competent. George Washington and Ben Franklin were both fine examples of this. Ben Franklin was a highly intelligent man and turned out to be a great diplomat. George Washington turned out to be the hero of the Revolutionary War when he led his armies, though he was not always well supported or trusted, but he remained steadfast throughout the war. They eventually did receive support and aid from France. That was another strength. Actually, that was critical. If they did not receive that, who knows how long the war might have gone on. They also were fighting defensively on their own soil. As you can imagine, when you're defending your own farms, your own family, your own cities, it makes a difference. But the colonists had many weaknesses of their own. They were badly organized for war. That is, they didn't even really have a standing army. They had all of these militias, but there was no organized standing army with the training and everything that went with that. So they were ill-prepared to fight battles, pathetically ill-prepared. They were almost fatally lacking in unity among the different colonies and among the people of those colonies were many royalists. And they were not interested in independence or separating from their mother country of England. They wanted to continue to be a colony of England. And they fought almost the entire war in this lack of unity before they adopted a constitution, which was not adopted until 1781, the Articles of Confederation. And there was a lot of jealousy in the different sections of the colonies. So the northern colonies, as we learned earlier, were very different than the central and southern colonies. And so they cared more about issues related to their sections of the country, and that undermined the unity of the colonies. They also had a lot of economic difficulties. As we talked about earlier, British mercantilism had drained away the gold and silver that might have helped them fight the war. So they printed paper currency, but this depreciated quickly, causing inflation, and pretty much that paper wasn't worth much. Some people resorted to using it as wallpaper because it had more value that way than it did being used to pay for things. They also had a huge shortage of military supply, including firearms. There was not one gun factory in the colonies. They had been getting all their weapons from overseas. When the militiamen reported for duty, only 1 in 12 reported with their own musket. This may have something to do with why the gun laws ended up in the Constitution, because they wanted people to show up with muskets when they came to defend their country. Other supplies were also scarce. You'll hear over and over about how the men of the Continental Army reported with limited clothing. Ultimately they didn't have shoes. There's talk in the winters of the blood that you would see in the snow whenever the army would march, because many of the soldiers did not have shoes, and they would be just bleeding from the challenge of getting around when they did not have what they needed. And then they lacked military training, as I talked about before. This made troops unreliable. They'd never fought before. Some ran, some stood their ground. They did not even know how to maintain a sanitary site at all, so that made for a lot of sickness in the ranks. In addition to that, American profiteers, undermined the effort. They sold their stuff to the British because they could pay in gold, and these troops did not have access to the resources. So Washington sometimes paid for things out of his own wallet. Fortunately, he was wealthy because there were no other resources available. And Congress was not that great at funding this and paying for it, since they were undermined a great deal. So who is going to win this war? If you look at it at the beginning, I think the odds were pretty much with the British, because they had a lot of wealth going for them, and they had trained armies. But there were some surprising strengths on the American side, too. And so we know eventually that the Americans prevail, but it's hard to tell at the beginning. I'm sure the British, when they launched the war, felt like, "Hey, we're going to beat these guys and they're going to pay."